So I'm Christo Wilson. I'm a professor at Northeastern. And today I want to talk about some experimental work we've been doing, looking at consent on the web. This was all being led by Aziz, who is very, very good at this kind of work. So just to set the table, right, I think we're all aware that privacy laws on the internet have been changing. Right? What started in Europe with GDPR has moved to California with the CCPA. There's now over a dozen states that have comprehensive online privacy bills. And they're all different in specific ways, but one of the commonalities is that they center user choice. Right? Users are allowed to make choices about data, and that should impact how the data flows around and is treated. So this has given us the world of consent banners. You go to websites, you go to apps, you're asked to make choices. And depending on the outcome of that choice, right, the way that data moves to different third parties should potentially change. Right? It's possible that some of those flows should be blocked entirely if a user opts out. Right? Don't transfer data at all. Or at a minimum, the user's choice to opt out, right, has to be communicated to the third parties so that they can behave differently, right? Minimize the data, or treat it as a service provider mode, or something like that. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing evidence that compliance with these laws is not perfect. Right? The California Attorney General's office has been very active. There have been a couple of high-profile lawsuits. Academic research is also starting to confirm there are issues here. People make choices, and then those choices are not respected. Right? The data still flows. They still get targeted ads. And so the question that was motivating us was why? Right? Why is it that when people make choices, those choices aren't necessarily respected? So when you start to poke at this problem, especially on the web as we've done, you start to realize that the issue of consent is enormously complicated. Right off the bat, you have a person, let's say they're visiting a website. Right? Their user agent can be providing some consent information in the form of global privacy control. Right? In addition, right, that website might have a consent management system or custom software presenting a banner where users can make choices. So one way or another, there's now multiple potential ways for a user to make a choice. Right? That choice then has to be exposed to other scripts and other parties so that they can act on that choice. But things are complicated. Right? GPC has its own API built into the DOM. Right? The Internet Advertising Bureau has many standards. Right? Trust and Consent Framework in Europe, USP was for California. Now there's the Global Privacy Platform, the GPP. Right? So there's a bunch of APIs there for exposing consent. And then you have the CMPs, of which there are many, and they have their own APIs for exposing consent that are bespoke and incompatible. Right? That then brings you to the third-party scripts. In theory, they should be reading consent information and acting on it, but there's many sources to get that information. They could disagree with each other, right? Which are the ones that should be believed or acted upon. Right? And then there are yet more third parties. Right? Something like a tag manager, it can communicate with an SSP or an ad exchange. Right? There might be sending data to a tracking pixel. Right? Again, the user's choices about consent have to be communicated out to all these other parties so that they can act on it appropriately. Right? So in total, this is enormously complex. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of opportunities for error, for consent to be lost. And then the user's choice isn't acted upon correctly. And so again, this is really what's motivating our work, looking around the web at how these systems are implemented, where consent choices are going wrong, and then ultimately, what can we do about that? So I will hand things over to Aziz to tell you about the methods and some of the things we've found.
Yeah, thank you, Christo. So I'm going to briefly describe our methodology in order to investigate this whole end-to-end consent data pipeline on the websites from publishers to the third parties and among the third parties. I designed a custom crawler and briefly put we investigated 7,000 top publishers from California, and our crawler automatically made different choices across different experiments. In one of the experiments, we opted out through global privacy control signal. In other experiment, we opted out by clicking on this reject all button on the cookie banners. And since we also want to investigate how these publishers are actually storing these consent choices of users made by the banners in these consent APIs, so our crawler also logs all the consent APIs and extract the consent information. And Also, we also want to investigate the ad scripts present on these websites are actually calling these consent APIs or not in order to get user consent choices. So we instrumented our crawler to logs all the third-party ad scripts calling to these APIs. And lastly, we also want to investigate whether these ad scripts are actually communicating these consent signals through HTTP requests and responses. So in order to answer that, we also logged all the HTTP requests and responses and all the URL parameters that can contain consent signals. And I'm going to briefly discuss some of the findings from our combined research work, so why the consent failure happens. So first question we tried to answer was like how well these consent APIs are adopted by different publishers. And by consent APIs in our work and today's talk, I'm going to focus on IAB APIs. And before I go further in detail, like how well these are adopted, I'm going to briefly describe what are these IAB APIs. This is basically a technical standard that's introduced by the advertisement different companies. And this is meant to transmit user consent all across the web. So briefly speaking, we looked into CCPA framework, which is known as USP API. That was meant to only apply across California. And the second one which we looked was GPP API, which is Global Privacy Platform and your consent framework, which applies across multiple jurisdictions and multiple states. And simply put, whenever someone's make a choice on a particular website, this standard requires that publishers should expose these APIs on the website. And in case of USP API, it should store this 4-character string, which should have a user opt-out choices. Like if a user has opted out, the third character in the string should be Y. So this is very simple because this was the first version they introduced. The latest version of the consent string is this, which is basically a very complicated consent string. So when a user make a choice, a publisher should have this consent string returned by the GPP API. And as you can see, like a publisher has to make a choice, okay, whether it applies to US California section, whether it applies to Florida section. And apparently this API also allows people to have the US national section in the US, even the US doesn't have a federal law. So I'm not sure exactly whether it applies. Maybe like it's encompassed across the US. So, but this is publisher's choice to make sure that these choices are properly encoded in these consent string. But coming back to our first question, the first question about are these actually frameworks being adopted by the publishers or not? But in the very first place, we found that only very few percentage of the publishers in our websites were adopting these consent frameworks. This is a little bit concerning, primarily because if third parties are actually relying on these APIs to retrieve user consent, they may not be able to retrieve or get user consent choices in the very first place. So second thing which we try to investigate was how well these ad scripts are actually calling the GPP API or GPC API or these consent APIs on the web to retrieve user consent. So in order to investigate that, I investigated all the ad scripts, third-party JavaScripts present on the web pages. There were roughly about 2,000. And out of those 2,000 ad scripts that I saw, I found unfortunately 85% of these ad scripts never interface with any of these consent APIs like GPC or IAB to retrieve user consent. So primarily they were either ignoring or not properly configured. And 15% of those were calling these APIs, and out of those 15%, only 9% of these third-party JavaScripts were calling these consent APIs consistently. So the failure mode second, which we observed, was these ad scripts don't read the consent APIs, or even if they read them inconsistently. Thirdly, we investigated if GPC signal is being properly respected and encoded by publishers and reflected properly by IAB APIs and CMP APIs. Recall that GPC is primarily right now applicable to California and other states, and is legally required to be respected in California. So what we did was we sent the GPC signal across all these publishers and then tried to see what are in those publishers' platform, what are these IAB APIs or consent APIs actually return. And unfortunately, similar to the prior work, we found like 15% of the publishers, even though the GPC signal said opted out, the IAB APIs, which are supposed to transmit user consent signal, still said a user has opted in for data selling or sharing. And we also looked at 3 top CMPs in our work because it could be possible that some publishers are not using this IAB consent standard. They're using the CMP-defined standards. And even in that cases, we found, for example, in case of OneTrust, we found 15% of the publishers where OneTrust was present, and GPC, we sent the GPC signal. OneTrust still allowed setting of the advertising cookies according to their own definition. And I just want to clarify very clear, we're not accusing anyone. We're simply saying that it could be possible that these publishers have determined that CCPA don't apply to them. It could be possible that CMP scripts, when we were analyzing, were not loaded properly because of the race conditions. So there could be multiple reasons for this reason happening. Second thing, okay, next thing we investigate, okay, even if the ad scripts are reading these consent APIs on the web, do they get the same signal? For example, if they call GPC API or IAB APIs or among the IAB APIs and a user has opted out, do they communicate the similar consent choices or not? And even in these cases, so to investigate that, we again investigate 800 websites and publishers in which you have this both older standard of IAB, which is a USB string, and then the GPB string. And across 15% of the publisher, I found like one of the string was saying that the user has opted out. The newer standard version was communicating that the user has opted in for data selling or sharing. Now, as an advertiser or third party, what signal you should be trusting, I think it's unclear. Similarly, I showed you this whole complicated consent string present on the web, and it has multiple sections. And each section could further be decoded into different fields. There's a official magic decoder available on the official website, which you can use to decode it. But this string present on the screen can be further decoded into 12 different fields. And we also looked into the inconsistencies in the same string in different fields. For example, in California, there is no distinction between selling and sharing, but you could specify in this string that you have to clearly specify that a user has opted out of selling of the data, but not, and you have to very clearly say that user has opted out of sharing of the data as well. So in this case, we found like about 20 publishers where they have set the field selling, that the user has opted out of selling of the data, but their sharing of the data was still allowed. So there was a little bit confusion between these bits as well. So there are conflicting signals present on the web. And lastly, we investigated the reach of the opt-out signals to the third parties in our GPC experiment or CMP experiment. So we opted out. And we try to see like top 20 advertisers. So x-axis is the top 20 advertisers, and y-axis is the percentage of the requests that contains opt-out signals to these advertisers. So in the case of our GPC experiment, we found that very low propagation of these opt-out signals was happening according to the technical definition of the specification, and advertisers were failing to receive the user's opt-out choices on the web. So coming back now, so we've discussed some of the failure modes, and the lessons are very brief. And firstly, we believe and we argue this whole consent ecosystem on the web is quite complex. There are so many optional parts. There are so many optional standards and consent APIs. Even in the way the consent is strong, it's sometimes very complicated. You have seen the GPP standard introduced by the advertising companies, and there are too many parties. So first thing I argue is try to simplify it. One of the ways we believe it could be simplified is publishers should try to honor GPC signal. It's very easy to implement on the client side. For example, you just have to set GPC header or global privacy control navigator. And even as a third-party advertiser, you could directly now read this signal in the browser on the client side. And you could even call the navigator object. And technically, you don't need any intermediary to transmit all the consent signals if you are sending and respecting GPC signal correctly and reacting. But in case you are trying to use as websites CMPs, then you need to make sure that the CMPs are actually reacting properly to these GPC signal. For example, if the CMPs are also using some of their own technical standards and APIs or IAB standards, then make sure that if the GPC signal is set to opt out, all of the underlying APIs or consent APIs also return that the user has opted out. Similarly, if you're trying to use some very technical, sophisticated standards, make sure that the consent strings within the same, since the US has multiple states, make sure if they're trying to use this GPP framework, all the fields agree with each other. For example, if the sales have opted out, then GPC should be set to opted out. Lastly, I haven't, my research was a little bit pre-January, which is 1 year ago, but I feel like LLM could be very useful case to avoid conflicts. You could provide your web logs to this LLM agent and provide the specification and try to see any conflicts being emitted by your websites or not, like network requests. Lastly, we think it's that if the user has opted out, one thing you could simply do is try to block marketing and tracking pixels and advertisement sourcing being loaded. One other thing which I found in my research was there were often race conditions, like CMP scripts present on the web pages sometimes would not even load before advertisement scripts could load. So as a publisher, again, the law requires you to make sure that CMP reacts properly. So you should try to do more testing that your CMP scripts get loaded and can block these advertisement scripts. And if you can't even block these ad scripts for some reason, you need to have those analytic scripts properly present. Make sure that they are compatible with all the consent standards that you are being introduced on the web platforms, and they're actually calling the ad scripts. And lastly, that you should check your network requests actually contain consent signals. And I'm going to conclude very quickly that it's not important to just give and get user consent through cookie banner. It's equally important to reliably transmit user consent to downstream parties before you can even act on it. And I'm happy to answer more questions. And yeah, paper and code link over here. Thank you.